What is going on? Welcome to the episode. Today we've got Dr. Malcolm Kendrick on the show, and we're talking all about heart disease. Now, this has been a topic that has been sort of elusive for me, and I haven't quite understood it until I came across Dr. Kendrick's work. So I find his theory of heart disease very, very interesting. So we're going to delve into that in this episode, as well as how to avoid getting it, of course, which is, very important. So without further ado, let's dive right into this one.
Why not just go about your everyday practice, being a GP, doing your thing, helping folks one-on-one? Why cover these highly controversial topics and buck the trend to begin with? What drove you to approach this heart disease topic?
I've been asked this many times, as you can imagine. I'm not a natural kind of academic, I don't think. I'm not. However, when I was at Aberdeen University, and this is going back a long time, Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world. So everybody says. That might even be true. I found that statistics are somewhat bendy at times, but it's definitely very high. It was a sort of part of what you found out. I mean, patients arrived at hospital with heart attacks, fairly young men. So it was a major thing. I mean, the major killer, it still is the major killer, but at that time in Scotland, the rate was, I think, 4 times higher than it currently is. It has dropped since then. And we were all told the usual stuff. It's because you eat cholesterol. It's because you've got saturated fat consumption. It's too high. Therefore it raises the cholesterol in your bloodstream. And I pretty much went along with this. Why wouldn't you? It's what everyone was saying, and it was what you were told. So I did go to France quite a lot. Quite keen on France, and I noted that the French had more saturated fat than we did in Scotland. Their cholesterol levels were pretty much the same, and the rate of heart disease was 1/5 of that in Scotland. And I thought, well, that sort of slightly seems to be doesn't really quite fit at the time, and you just still hear this sometimes, although it seems to have gone out of fashion. They had a thing called the French paradox. Well, we know that they eat all this saturated fat, but they're actually protected. This was the idea. They're protected by lightly cooking their vegetables, eating garlic, and drinking red wine. This was the explanation that was given at the time. And people, this is why you'll see all these ridiculous things about red wine being protective against heart disease. Although when anyone actually decided to actually find out whether this was correct or not, it was like, well, one of the major researchers just made up the research. I can't remember his name. It was a substance called resveratrol. Resveratrol, that's right. And then when they actually found out, he just made up his figures. So a bit like a lot of things in this area, when you actually look into it, dig into it, the garlic thing was nonsense. The lightly cooked vegetable thing was nonsense. And really there was no explanation. So I began to think, well, there's got to be something else going on. And once you start down this path of saying, you know what, this doesn't really make any sense. Once you start down that pathway, you start looking at more and more things and seeing, well, this doesn't make any sense, and that doesn't make any sense. And in fact, while I was at Aberdeen University, I was taught some cardiology by a female cardiologist researcher, which at that time was a very rare beast indeed. And she said, and this was during a small group session, she said, LDL cannot cross the endothelium. And we all nodded sagely. I had no idea what LDL was. I didn't really know what the endothelium was, but I still thought, well, the way that she said it, I thought, this is fascinating. Why am I, it's like someone, it's like in a detective story or a book, there's always a clue that's given. It's a little thing. And at the time, it seems insignificant, but when you realize that was the clue, that explained everything, But didn't you have a blue hat on or something like that? It's like, oh my goodness, and the whole world starts to break apart at that point. And to an extent, that I think that's what happened here was the world, as you started to study it increasingly, just all the time, you're thinking, well, none of this fits together, none of it makes sense. So I got rid of the saturated fat part fairly quickly in my mind because that was clearly just nonsense. But it took me quite a while to get rid of the cholesterol bit because it seemed to make sense. raised cholesterol. Obviously, there is no such thing as cholesterol in your bloodstream, but we'll let that pass. But a high level of a substance that we call cholesterol that isn't cholesterol in our bloodstream leaks into the blood vessel or artery walls, and then they thicken and narrow, and eventually they become very narrow, and then they fully block, and you have a heart attack or a stroke. If you don't think about it very much or at all, that story seems very simple. It's a clear story, and I think here is the danger of it. People love a story, and a simple story, something they can almost visualize. So I think everyone's got this in their head. Oh, well, the artery blockages are kind of fatty and gooey. And if we eat fatty, gooey stuff, well, the fatty, gooey stuff will end up in our arteries, and then the fatty, gooey stuff will kill us. And so I remember it was actually Tom Norton who said, I think it's word association, the word fat. We don't like the word fat. So the idea that anything fat causes damage to us is obviously correct, because fat is nasty, and we don't like fat things, and we don't like fat people, and fat. That's it. That's the answer. And then you think, well, of course, this is about a scientific thing that the moon's made of cheese. Or that the Earth is at the center of the universe. So, well, it makes sense if you don't think about it. Once you start thinking about it, it's like, no, the Earth cannot be at the center of the universe, because then the observations don't make any sense. And I think this is it. Once you start looking into it, you become more and more, you're almost like, how could anyone believe this? How could anyone believe that? And then you think, well, why is it up to me to try and point all this out? Surely this should just be pointed out. And then you realize, well, actually no one else is pointing it out. So what's that expression? If not you, who? If not now, when? So I think the question is, it's me. Oh dear, it's now. Because I don't want to sort of reach my doddering old age thinking, you know what, I should have done something about that. I should have said something. It was up to me, and I said nothing. So I can hardly blame the world when I feel I could have done something about it. So that's a fairly long answer to a fairly short question, but I hope it gives some idea of my thinking.
I love it. Now, I like to think that I understand a bit about the body by now, but I have been following, some super smart people far smarter than me, that seem to still not understand this whole heart disease thing. And I'm like, okay, what about this specific topic am I not getting? Until I listened to your podcast recently on the Nourish, Balance, Thrive podcast, and it just clicked. It made sense. And so I kind of want to start there as far as how you explain heart disease to someone in layman terms, and then sort of dig into blood pressure, cholesterol, saturated fats, all that sort of stuff in more detail. But let's start there, just because this is such a mysterious topic that, I feel that we should understand, but we don't by now, apparently, in the mainstream medicine. So let's start there.
Well, I think that if you dismiss the LDL cholesterol, saturated fat from your mind, which I try to say to people, you think yourself in a different world where these things don't work. And then think of it again as I sometimes say to people, it's like we have a jigsaw puzzle with 1,000 pieces. Someone's thrown it on the floor and said, there's a picture there, what's the picture? And the first thing that you have to do, of course, is to remove LDL cholesterol, saturated fat from that picture. At the moment, everyone says these 3 pieces fit at the center, and they must fit there, and you can't move them. And of course, then when you try and fit the other pieces around it, they all just have to be twisted and bent until eventually you just have a complete incomprehensible mess. So I started again of looking at the kind of, there's more than 1,000 pieces to this jigsaw puzzle. I only mentioned about 30 of them or something in the book, but essentially I could find you 1,000 things that have been associated with heart disease easily. Give me half a day and I can find you a paper on everything. All right. And then you find yourself thinking, well, how do they all cause heart disease? How does smoking and say diabetes, which are a couple of things that we know for sure cause heart disease, what are they doing? They must be doing the same thing, because they're causing the same disease. So why do you think there's several diseases that all look the same that are caused by different things? Which is always a possibility, but I think there isn't. There is only one disease here. There is thickenings in the arteries. They get bigger and bigger. They do this. This is true. I'm not saying this isn't true. Eventually, they become the focus for a blood clot that eventually blocks a large blood vessel. Now, there's variations on this theme, terms and conditions apply, etc., etc. But that's basically what's going on. And this can happen in any artery in your body. So then you find yourself thinking, right, well, we've got smoking and we've got diabetes. Right. What can they both be doing that is doing the same thing? And I sometimes use an analogy. If you think of an artery, or remember, this disease only happens in arteries, only happens in larger arteries, doesn't happen in veins, doesn't happen in your lungs, etc., etc. You've got all these provisos start coming in. You feel like you're being a lawyer, By the way, read my 300-page sort of accessory volumes on what we're talking about, and then everyone's bored because, anyway, the arteries are where this thing happens. They're normally the larger arteries, and the arteries are relatively thick. They're lined. They have a lining, which is a super smooth, extra special protective lining on them, and if that is not damaged, nothing can happen. Let's start with that basic point. This lining they're called endothelial cells. Some people call them the endothelium. You can read papers calling them the epithelium. You can read papers calling them the intima. You can read papers calling them a million different things. But essentially, they're all talking about the same thing, just doing it really complicated so you can't understand what they're talking about, which is true of all this area. Anyway, so you have the artery. It's got a thick-ish wall. It's bound together with a tight outside bit. It's got a middly bit, which is mainly smooth muscles that contract and expand it. And on the inside, you've got endothelial cells, and they are lining your artery, right? So the first step, the first process of step that has to happen is you have to, in some way, damage the lining, all right? And you say, well, how can you damage the lining? And the analogy I sometimes use is, say you've got the paintwork on your car. It can, if it's damaged, your car can then rust. It's not true of all cars. I had cars that rusted without any preceding damage. But in general, nowadays, cars are much better. So if you don't scratch the paintwork, then the water can't get at the metal, and the salt can't get at the metal, and no rust occurs. And then you say, well, what can damage the paintwork of your car? And I'm sure that anyone listening to this, or you can think of 100 things off the top of your head. If another car bashes into it and a stone flies up, a key sort of is used and misses the lock and scratches the paintwork, or as I've used in the book, a tin of baked beans falls out your shopping and bangs into the side of the car. So if you're saying, well, how can a tin of baked beans and a stone and a shopping trolley all cause the same problem? Well, the answer is not what they are. It's not what they do. And this is where I thought about this for years, and a very clever man once said, forget about causes, think about process. Think about the process. And this is where it all started to finally come together in my head. Okay, so first of all, you damage the lining of the artery wall, at which point a blood clot forms, as it must do. And there's billions and billions of papers showing that if you damage the endothelium, then you get a blood clot. Now, it may be a very small blood clot, maybe so small you could hardly even see it, but it has to form because it triggers blood clots to form. Because when this endothelium is gone, it exposes the underlying artery to the blood, and the blood doesn't like being exposed to blood vessels. It says, there's something nasty going on here. I must form an immediate blood clot. And it does. And that clot may be quite small. And in fact, for as many factors of making the blood clot start, there's another 20 making it stop. It's a terrifically complicated system. I think it's like hunting all the time. Clot, don't clot, clot, don't clot. And there's a whole bunch of factors over here saying clot, and there's a whole bunch of factors here saying stop. So the blood clot doesn't get very big before it stops forming. And then, of course, what happens to it? Well, it's stuck to your artery wall. And if it's reasonably large, it cannot be allowed to just break off and travel further down the artery, or it will just cause mayhem and cause a blockage further down. So the body has to do something else with it. And what it does with it is it covers it over with a new layer of endothelial cells. And for many years, you could go back to 1852 when people were first discussing this. A chap called Rokitansky, he looked at plaques and said, these are just blood clots in different stages of repair. And then Virchow, who he's working with, said, well, how can a blood clot form underneath the endothelium? Because they could see these things at this time. They had microscopes and they were studying it. So people who say there was no such thing as heart disease before the 20th century, I say, well, these guys were studying it in detail in the mid-19th century. Anyway, his problem was he couldn't explain how a blood clot could exist in or form or be present underneath the endothelium. And it wasn't until the mid-1990s, really, that people said, well, there are actually cells produced in the bone marrow They float around in the bloodstream. And when they see an area of damage, they stick to it and they grow into fully formed endothelial cells. So they're called endothelial progenitor cells, EPCs, which most you speak to a doctor, they never heard of. Doctors have never heard of any of this stuff. Don't worry about it. I'll do the thinking for you. Anyway, so the EPCs stick to the clot and they cover it over. So it's almost like a magic trick. How did the clot get into the artery wall? Well, it didn't sneak through the endothelium. When it happened, the endothelium wasn't there. That's the answer. And a new layer of endothelium grew on top of it and basically effectively drew it into the artery wall, at which point it was repaired and got rid of mostly. This is happening inside your arteries all the time. I hate to say, don't worry about it. But the repair systems are operating. So the new layer of endothelium grows, what they call the white cells, the macrophages come along and chomp it up and get rid of it and break it up. And so mostly you'll never even know it's there. You can't see that you can see signs of it there. You can see signs of remnant clots that are invisible to the naked eye. It can be measured. I'm leaving that aside. So this process of damage to the artery wall, blood clot forms, blood clot isn't quite got rid of, and then that becomes the focus for another clot, because you now have a slight weakness here, or a sort of focus, if you like. And so at this focus point is where things are likely to happen in the future. And so you have a point where it gradually, you have repeated episodes, if you like. And then, of course, once the repeated episodes have caused a big enough thickening in the artery, that becomes the focus for the final big one that completely blocks the artery and causes the heart attack or the stroke or the renal damage or whatever, wherever the clot happens. Commonest places for clots are that within the heart arteries and within the arteries in the neck, the coronary and the carotid arteries. These are the two commonest places, but they can happen anywhere really. So that is really the process. The process is damage, clot, repair. And the problem happens is if the damage is faster than the repair. So it's really a balance of things. I sometimes say potholes in the road. You know, roads eventually get worn away. You know, cars bounce on them, the rain gets into them, the snow comes on them, and etc. And eventually you'll get a pothole developing. That doesn't matter if the local council covers it over and retarmacs it over and smooths it out. You're okay. But if they decide not to do the repair and they decide they can't be bothered or they run out of money, you'll get huge potholes. And whilst the plaque is not a pothole, it's the same concept of, does the damage outstrip the repair? And if it does, you've got a problem. So really what you're looking at is things that can cause more damage to the artery wall, things that can make the blood clots bigger and more difficult to shift will increase your risk of heart disease. Things that damage the repair systems as well. Because if you don't produce endothelial progenitor cells, or you dampen down the repair processes, in a way that just accelerates the process as well. So there's three things to look at: damage to the artery wall, formation of a blood clot, repair systems. And if you look at it on that basis, then you can bring together these things. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And the way that my brain thought about it initially when I heard you explain it was, versus potholes on the street, more so speed bumps on a single highway. And as those speed bumps just build up, eventually there's a blockage at some point. Yeah. But it's amazing because also when you were explaining it, how similar it sounds to leaky gut in the way that damage is created. You know, things are getting into areas that the body doesn't want them, and it's causing issues. The body then forms a clot, or, you know, it's basically the best case scenario given what the situation is. The body's just trying to do what it does best, which is survive. So that's the way that I thought about it in terms of leaky gut. I don't know if that resonates with you.
Well, I think, when I think a lot of things that happen that people say, here is a disease. So when you look at Alzheimer's, they're looking at plaques forming, and then they're trying to get rid of these plaques that are formed. And when you say, well, the plaques actually appear to be the way the body's trying to protect the neurons from further damage.
Exactly.
What you're looking at is the body trying to repair itself, and you're mistaking repair for damage, for the causal thing. Yes, if you can stop the plaques and whatever is building up, then you're doing something else that's preventing the Alzheimer's or the heart disease or whatever. But you're getting causality mixed up, and this is a very common thing. It's like A causes B. It's the old-fashioned thing of yellow fingers and lung cancer. It's found that people who have yellow fingers are more likely to die of lung cancer. Well, yes, because they're smokers. It's not the yellow fingers causing the lung cancer. It's the smoking that causes the yellow fingers and the lung cancer. And I think medicine's terrible at looking at something that seems abnormal and saying that is the disease, rather than, well, what's causing that to happen? At the moment, people are saying to me, oh, well, the heart disease is actually an inflammatory disease. Well, inflammation doesn't happen spontaneously. To me, that's like saying to someone, the reason why your ankle broke is because of increased inflammation at your ankle joint. No, I think you'll find that broken ankle precedes the inflammation.
Yeah.
Because inflammation is the body trying to repair itself. It might go wrong in its repair systems, but inflammation is just the body. You call it, the trouble is the word inflammation sounds unhealthy. If you call it repair, or you call it, something else, this is the immune system or whatever. This is our repair systems trying to do their job. Now, they may overdo their job. If you get a scar, you can get keloid scarring and you get a big scar. That's just, but the keloid scar didn't cause the inflammation. We have this weirdness in our thinking. So again, I like that similarity. They're looking at the wrong thing, and they're not understanding why that thing is actually the body trying to prepare itself. It is not the cause of the thing. What's going on underneath that thing is what you should be looking at. So you need to step it back. And I find that this is a common problem in, seems to be medical thinking. They see a thing they think is abnormal. They decide that's the thing that needs to be treated. And coincidentally, it might work, I suppose, but it would only be coincidence if it did. So yes, I entirely agree that our processes are similar and our thinking is stupid.
It's remarkably similar to cancer as well, in terms of, repair that just cannot keep up with demand, because we all have millions of cancerous, tumors, cells, whatever in our bodies at any given time that the immune system is dealing with. But as soon as that repair can't keep up with the demand and there's an imbalance there, we run into issues as well. So it's amazing how all of these things in the body work in this specific way that seem to be autoimmune in nature when you really, like you said, peel it back. But this heart disease specifically seems to be this mysterious thing where there are so many issues at play that people just kind of throw their hands up in the air and they're like, all right, well, let's use a statin, let's.
Well, I mean, the idea that the raised LDL, low density lipoprotein, this substance that carries cholesterol around in your body, well, it's not the only thing that does. There's plenty of other things that carry it around, but they focused on this one as the causal mechanism. And again, they've got the story very simple. They've said, oh, look, you can find LDL particles or molecules or whatever you want to call them within plaques, so that must be causing it. And you go, well, have another think about that, because the first thing is that when a blood clot forms, almost everything in the blood gets dragged in, so you're going to find everything in there as you do. I mean, you'll find lots of red blood cells in there. You say, well, do red blood cells cause atherosclerotic plaques? No one's ever said that. Well, you can find free cholesterol inside atherosclerotic plaques that forms crystals. And we know the only place that can come from is a red blood cell membrane. It's the only place that's got pure cholesterol in a high enough concentration to form a crystal. So you find crystals in cholesterol crystals are found in atherosclerotic plaques. And then you say, oh, that's because of the raised cholesterol in your blood. And you go, but the raised cholesterol in your blood is entirely different than that. You cannot even get one from the other. It's things like this that are just simple science. You say, well, what we're seeing here is something completely different. So when they find what they say are LDL molecules, well, again, if you spoke to almost all the doctors that you can speak to and say to them, have you ever heard of LPA? And they go, no. I go, well, no, you don't. You haven't, have you? LPA is, and this is, of course, is when the terminology gets bonkers, isn't it? Because LPA stands for lipoprotein A, which sounds very different than low-density lipoprotein. It's actually the same thing, except LPA is a lower-density lipoprotein with an added protein stuck to it called apolipoprotein A. That's why it's called lipoprotein A. It should really be called LDL-A, and then people would realize it's just LDL. And then this is the lipid that's lipoprotein that's closely associated with blood clotting. In fact, when a blood clot starts, LPA is attracted to when the artery is damaged, one of the first things that's attracted to it is LPA along with platelets, and they all stick together and form this sort of first part of the clot. So how would you know if you looked at a plaque and you saw LDL molecules? How would you know if they're LDL or LPA? How would you know? Well, the only way you know is to look for the additional protein, apolipoprotein A. If you don't look for it, you obviously don't find it, and hardly anyone ever looks for it. So there are researchers who have looked for LPA or apolipoprotein A in plaques, and guess what? They find it. And then people have said, but you can also find apolipoprotein B, which everybody's probably heard of, B100. So, well, of course they will, because this lipoprotein, this protein called apolipoprotein B100, other terminologies, is attached to all LDL molecules, and it's also attached to all LPA molecules. So if you can find A and B in the same place, there is only one place that can come from, and that is LPA, lipoprotein A. It cannot have come from LDL. So people look in plaques, they find what they think are LDL molecules. They find apolipoprotein B100 molecules, and they go, aha, it's LDL in there. And they go, no, it's not. I mean, and no one even bothers to, it's like, hello, did you ever look? No, you didn't, did you? And look, here's the guys who looked at a whole bunch of sections of people who'd had coronary arteries taken out to have bypass grafts, and then they studied them, and then they stained them, and they said, yeah, what we're finding here is apolipoprotein A and B at the same place. And then the experts say, oh, that's LDL, isn't it? I mean, it is like, standing in front of someone, shouting hello, and they just look past you and go, oh yeah, I can see LDL over there. Like, no, it's LPA. Oh, it's LDL, isn't it? LPA. Oh, LDL. No.
So why for the folks listening, and they've heard, generally all of these terms, HDL, LDL, LP(a), all of this sort of stuff. Why does LPA matter? Why should folks be looking at LPA or care about LPA?
I'll skip over the vitamin C thing anyway, but animals that don't produce their own vitamin C have got LPA, this specific lipoprotein in their bloodstream. Why have they got it? Because it helps to protect the body. Well, if you get a crack in a blood vessel, obviously what happens is you can bleed. All right. Bleeding is not a good thing in nature. We want to stop bleeding. So if people have a lack of vitamin C, LPA comes to the rescue and forms these plugs that plug the damage. They're not going to work forever, but they might keep you alive for a while until you get enough vitamin C. That the vitamin C does its thing and acts to produce more collagen that strengthens up your blood vessels and stops them cracking. So LPA is a kind of fudge, a kind of patch substance. We don't make our own vitamin C. That means we're likely to get cracks in our arteries. That means we're likely to bleed. Along comes LPA, sticks to your artery wall. And the reason why it's so effective is because it stops the blood clots from being broken apart. And it can do this because all blood clots, when they form, draw in, well, apart from everything else, they draw in a thing called plasminogen. And plasminogen is a protein, and plasminogen is converted to plasmin by tissue plasminogen activator, which is a clot buster, which you may have heard people being given when they have a heart attack or stroke. So it breaks the clot apart. So plasminogen is turned to plasmin. Plasmin breaks the fibrin strands apart, and the clot is disintegrated. Not entirely, but a lot of it is shaved away and gone. Apolipoprotein A is exactly the same as plasminogen, except for a fold at the end of it. How proteins are folded is critical to the structure. So it's folded that way rather than that way, or whichever way it's folded. So when the TPA comes along and tries to break the clot apart, it encounters apolipoprotein A, and the apolipoprotein A blocks it. So it inhibits its action. So the clot cannot be so readily broken apart. So clots that have LPA in them are quite difficult to be got rid of. And then, therefore, they stick around for longer. And even if they may not be enormous at the first instance, instead of having a blood clot that size on your artery wall, you've got a blood clot that size on your artery wall, and it's more difficult to get rid of. So it becomes a focus, more readily becomes a focus. And the further blood clots that form in that area are more difficult to get rid of because you have this inhibiting action. This apolipoprotein A is an inhibitor of tissue plasminogen activator, and tissue plasminogen activator is required to make blood clots shave away, because if every time a blood clot formed, you couldn't then get rid of it once the repair had happened behind the clot. We'd just be one big blood clot. We would just be dead of blood clotting. Or if you caused a bruise and you had blood clotting, it would take years to get rid of it. So this system is very important. Again, it's this repair and it's the speed of the process going on. So LPA doesn't cause damage to your artery walls. It's not a cause of endothelial damage. But if you do damage the endothelium, LPA comes in, bam, and then makes the clot much more difficult to get rid of. And especially the part that's right next to the exposed area of damage, which makes sense. Because what you don't want, again, is a blood clot forms, TPA comes along, whole clot gets shaved off and breaks away, and then another blood clot forms, and it gets shaved away, and another blood clot forms. So you have to have something within the inner layer that says, stop. And that's, to an extent, what LPA is doing. So when you start thinking about function, it all makes perfect sense. I don't quite understand what happens in animals that don't have LPA. They must have something else going on. I've never really looked at that. I mean, one animal that does have LPA that wouldn't expect is guinea pigs, because they don't produce vitamin C either. And there was some fascinating research done in the 60s where they made guinea pigs scorbutic, which means total lack of vitamin C, at which point they developed atherosclerotic plaques at really high speed. They then gave them back vitamin C, and if they gave it back soon enough, the atherosclerotic plaques disappeared, were gone. And as far as I'm aware, this research has only been done once, which is quite fascinating. And you may know that from research and other stuff, a guy called Linus Pauling, who people have probably heard of, he believed that vitamin C was the cure for heart disease, high dose vitamin C, because it stopped all the cracks in your arteries from ever happening. Therefore, with no cracks in your arteries, no plaques formed. End of story. His ideas are still being promoted quite widely. There is a Linus Pauling Foundation that says everyone should take more vitamin C. Now, I think if your cracks in your arteries are being caused by a lack of vitamin C, yes, you need vitamin C. And if you have a high LPA level at the same time, you certainly need vitamin C, because any crack is going to cause an excessive response with the blood clot situation. So if someone says you've got high LPA, that doesn't necessarily mean that's a problem in itself, but it does mean that if you say smoke, or if you become vitamin C deficient, or you do other things that damage your arteries, you're going to get an accelerated problem occurring. So that's what's going. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that, it'll be helpful for folks if don't just start crushing vitamin C. I think it's important to, taking a big picture approach, take a step back and look at, chances are you're probably not, you don't have a perfect quote unquote diet, and then you're just vitamin C deficient. It's probably your nutritional approach as a whole. So be sure that you're, eating, a quality diet across the board. I doubt that somebody's favoring single ingredient whole foods and then all of a sudden they're just vitamin C deficient specifically. Yes. So yeah.
Well, I think the other thing to bear in mind is there's a very complicated thing that happens with blood glucose and vitamin C, because as you know, vitamin C, of course, everyone knows this, vitamin C is actually synthesized from glucose in animals that can do this. And so the molecules are very similar. There is a shuttling system that we've got. This may be why we don't produce vitamin C. There's a shuttling system in the red blood cells we have, which allows us to kind of reuse vitamin C. So it gets transformed and reused. But of course, high blood glucose level can interfere with the shuttling system. So your vitamin C level effectively drops. So this is complicated stuff, and I don't think I fully understand it. But it seems clear that if you move away from a higher carbohydrate diet, your vitamin C consumption doesn't need to be raised at all, because you can deal with quite a little or a low level of vitamin C consumption. If you start having high blood sugar levels and high carbohydrate intake, it strips the vitamin C out of your system more rapidly. So it's not just an intake issue; it's also a sort of strip out and get rid of issue. So for people who have, say, diabetes or pre-diabetes, it's especially important to look at your vitamin C maybe as an isolated thing, because otherwise you are likely to become effectively deficient more easily than if you didn't have these situations. Is that clear? Or, yeah.
Yeah, it is. And so how is it that, type 2 diabetes, or just diabetes in general, is leading to some of these issues? Because folks are thinking, okay, clotting, that's an issue. We don't want high blood pressure, stuff like that. But how is it that maybe obesity is going to tie in here, but also diabetes is leading to issues on the heart disease front?
Yeah. Well, this is interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think diabetes is probably from a population-wide basis, in that more people have diabetes, pre-diabetes than probably any other single thing. I think I'm not sure if that's in there. The obesity diabetes link, by the way, is another interesting area. I'm not going to get into that. But I believe that diabetes causes obesity, and then that requires a redefinition of diabetes. However, moving away from that situation, if you have a high blood sugar level, it's been found that a high blood sugar level, one thing I haven't mentioned yet, absolutely critical, is endothelial cells are lined with a little forest called Glycocalyx. If you try and pick up a fish, not all fish, but a lot of fish, they just slip from your fingers because they're covered in a slippery layer, very slippery layer. It's called the Glycocalyx, and it's a layer of glucose and proteins and kind of little fronds of things. It's a super Teflon substance, and if you scrape it off the fish, obviously you can then hold the fish with more ease. All of our endothelial cells, even in the smallest blood vessels, are lined with endothelium, which is like little fronds of glucose and protein strands. And within there was also buried anticoagulant substances and enzymes and things that stop the blood clotting and things that stop anything sticking to the artery wall. So a healthy glycocalyx is the first line of defense against endothelial damage. And the glycocalyx is particularly affected by high blood sugar levels. Quite exactly what's going on here. You think, well, a substance made of glucose and protein should quite enjoy having glucose around, but actually it doesn't. It strips it away and damages it. So if you had, say, your glycocalyx was sort of that big, normally healthy, it would shrink down to sort of looking like that. And you can measure this. You can measure the glycocalyx. You can actually see it, and you can see it shrinking in various conditions. Like if you have sepsis, the glycocalyx shrinks way down, which is why the endothelial cells are under horrible attack. And with high glucose levels, the glycocalyx shrinks down. So this allows more things to damage the endothelial cells, like high blood pressure with them, as you said, the speed bump. If you're at a speed bump point, bifurcation in the blood vessel, then you're going to get this sort of area where there's higher stress on the endothelium, and that's where it's going to be damaged. And if your glycocalyx is thinned down, you're going to get double damage. The other thing that happens with diabetes is because the glycocalyx exists also in the tiniest capillaries, like one red blood cell thick blood vessels. You get damage in the kidneys because the very small blood vessels that are required for the kidneys to function start to become damaged, and the nephrons, the units that make up the kidneys' function, start to be damaged. Also, you get damage at the back of your eyes because the small blood vessels here, they start to break down, and you get blood clots, and you get aneurysms, and you get loss of vision in your eyes. It's the same thing that's going on, and also it's why you get what they call peripheral loss of blood vessels. So you get the neuropathy with diabetes, because the tips of your fingers and the tips of where the blood vessels reach to, these small blood vessels are beginning to die off, and so you get damage because the neurons here start to die off as well. So you get this numbness and tingling. So diabetes is especially bad because it damages the kidneys, it damages the eyes, it damages the nerves, it damages the large blood vessels at the same time. So this high blood sugar level is really a significant problem around the whole body. So it's not just affecting the big blood vessels. It's not just causing atherosclerosis. It's causing what they also call microvascular disease, the disease in the very small blood vessels, the capillaries and the arterioles as well. So this is why it causes this wider spread problem. So people get ulcers with diabetes, and they get breakdown because the blood supply to the skin starts to be reduced. So if you get damage to the skin, it starts to break down more easily and more difficult to repair. So quite a common thing that happens with diabetes is you get reduced blood supply to the periphery, you get infection, you get gangrene, and people lose limbs because of this. So that's why it happens. So it's the high glucose, probably the high glucose level. It may be insulin itself at high levels, because you can show that high insulin levels also have some quite unpleasant effects on the endothelium themselves. There's a lot of things going on. It may not just be the blood sugar, but that's probably the key player. So that's how diabetes causes the problems for the large blood vessels and the small blood vessels. So it's a major sort of health problem that we face, and that's what's going on. Does that make sense? Do you think? Yeah,
it does. And those glycocalyx are fascinating in the sense that they want to keep everything moving through the arteries, right? The priority is to keep the blood flowing so they're not sticky. They're very slippery. Yes. However, when that endothelium or those highways are damaged, we start to get, as you put it, pots in the road. And then things begin to stick, and that's where a clot can potentially form, and that causes issues. So it's just, the body is amazing. It really is.
Well, I'm amazed we're not all dead, because when you start looking at this stuff, there's so many things that can go wrong. How do we ever survive? But it is quite amazing. I mean, when you look at it in a way, if you start thinking about process and think, why is the body doing this? What is happening to the body? Things become clearer. And I think when you have a problem with saying this seems abnormal and then building an entire hypothesis around it is where you get yourself into trouble. Why would the body do this? Why is this happening? What's the problems it's causing, and why does that reveal itself in certain ways? And I think somehow or other medicine's got away from that ways of thinking about things, I think, a bit. Or maybe it's always been like this, I don't know. But at the moment it seems very rigid in its thinking and looking at things in isolation. It's what I've called reductionist thinking, which is you look at the small thing and you decide that thing has gone wrong, and it's that going wrong thing that's causing all the problem. And instead of saying, well, why is it going wrong? Why does that happen? It's you've got to keep moving through the systems and asking yourself the broader questions, I think, because otherwise you just get stuck. That's why it's one of my great bugbears is people say, oh, well, heart disease is multifactorial. And you go, that doesn't actually mean anything. It's just guff. So when you get like 20 factors that make up the risk factor calculator we have in the UK, and it's got rheumatoid arthritis, and it's got smoking, and it's got age, and it's got sex, and it's got postcode, which is zip code in America. It's like, fine. I understand these things are associated with a high rate of heart disease. Some of them may even cause it. But you can't just say, oh, it's multifactorial. Every disease is multifactorial.
Everything is multifactorial.
It's like, what is actually going on? How do these different things actually fit together? I use the Poincaré, a French mathematician, who said, a pile of stones is no more a hypothesis than it is a house. That's not quite the correct description, but he's saying, just throwing piles of stones on the ground and going, there you are. You go, but that's just a pile of stones. I needed to see how they fit together to create a coherent scientific hypothesis. So what makes sense is the first event is that the artery is damaged in some way and a small blood clot forms on it, and that's the start. And everything that happens after that is the same process, just the same process all the way through. It's just that as it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, the chances of an fully blocking blood clot become bigger and bigger. It's the same process. How else do you explain that somebody can have one plaque, one place in their body and nowhere else? Well, the LDL level has been the same everywhere else in their body. So why have you got one? Why don't they thicken up everywhere? If LDL is leaking through, Why don't they thicken up your veins? Why doesn't it thicken up in your blood vessels in your lungs? Why is it only one type of blood vessel that it thickens up in one place? Or sometimes, I mean, most people have more than one, but you can find people who've died of one plaque in one place in one coronary artery, nowhere else. So something has specifically triggered it there. You can take a vein from someone's leg and use it as a coronary artery bypass. It's the same person with the same level of everything in their blood. The vein is completely free of any atherosclerosis. You stick it in the heart, within 7 years on average, it's blocked up again. So what's the difference? The difference is purely the biomechanical stress, or whatever word or term you want, that is completely different in your leg as a vein. It's under hardly any strain. You stick it in your heart and suddenly you've got the heart pumping like that next to it. You know, the heart pumps so hard. The blood vessels in the heart only allow blood to get through when the heart is relaxing. So they call diastole. And the rest of the body, as the heart pumps, the blood moves forward. But when the heart contracts, the blood in the heart stops. And when it relaxes, the blood can move. Just gives you some idea of the pressures that these blood vessels are under. So you can imagine, as someone described it, your arteries in your heart, it's like stomping on a garden hose 100 times, 60 times a minute. You know, well, of course they're under huge stress. The arteries in your neck, they come straight out of your heart and up into your neck. And these are the highest pressure, most vulnerable vessels. So, you know, where are you going to get atherosclerosis? There and there. If it's due to biomechanical stress, damage to the endothelium. You know, you can't explain this in any other way. So I mean, to me, it's just it's dead simple. It took me ages to get to this point of simplicity, but it's like, I sort of feel like I've become the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. You know, hello, it's over there. It's going, it's an elephant. It's a banana. No, it's over there, and it's that. All right. Why can't you see this? Why, you know, what is preventing you from seeing the absolutely bleeding obvious? Why can't you just see it? I do feel like that, but it's like, well, I'll wait, but I'll keep pointing it out to you. Maybe I'm the only person who's currently got an eye open at the moment. There are some people, but the rest of them, it's like, oh, it's an LDL molecule. It's like, no, it's not. Just stop being so stupid. It can't be that. Move on, ladies and gentlemen, you know?
Okay, Malcolm, that makes way too much sense. I think that's the problem. So what can folks do from a practical lifestyle implementation standpoint? We know smoking causes issues. Diabetes is a problem. What can folks, how can they take this information and be like, okay, I don't want heart disease, of course. I don't want to have a stroke. What can they do?
Yeah, well, you can probably do a lot of things that I'd imagine you support people in doing, is eating food that looks like food, that's got all the proper nutrients in it. You don't have to read the side of a fish to know what's inside a fish. You know, imprint in letters this size on the side of a cow saying this cow contains the following substances, you know, because this is stuff that we are designed to eat. You are not designed to eat rubbish stuff that's hyper processed. It's been had all the nutrients taken out and then stuffed back in some weird fashion. Eat natural food. Enjoy your eating. Don't see food as the enemy. You know, when I looked at France, my original thought was the French spend a lot of time eating. They're relaxed when they eat. They eat with friends. They eat with family. It's a big thing. And I still believe that's true, that if you eat properly, in other words, relax, chat, have a glass of wine, whatever, then your food is dealt with better by your body. If you stuff down to McDonald's while you're running from one meeting to another, you've got your body in two different states, physiological states. You've got it in fight and flight, and you've got it in relax and eat, and your body doesn't know what to do, so it kind of messes it up. If exercise is good because it reduces a lot of the stress hormones, reduces your blood pressure, it triggers on all sorts of systems that are actually good for you. Now, I do say don't go mad, because at the moment we have people saying you have to take 270 minutes a week, and you have to raise your blood pressure by 1.732%, higher than 9.84%, less than 24.62%. It's like, just go out for a walk, you know, enjoy it. And you see the big shiny thing up in the sky? We were designed for that thing to shine on us quite a lot. Don't hide yourself away from it. Sunshine is extremely good for you. Being outside is extremely good for you. Having friends and supportive family is extremely good for you, because if your system, if your body's what I call the fight or flight, chronically activated negative stress system is extremely bad for you, possibly the worst thing for you of all. The things that reduce life expectancy more than anything are mental illnesses. Schizophrenia, average 30 years, 35 years loss of life expectancy. I just saw a study showing that people who've got severe mental illness are far more likely to die from COVID. And I'm like, people will be going, how can this possibly be? So it's really good for you if you're nice and relaxed and you don't get upset like I do. I've decided that anger is a good thing so long as you have a purpose for it.
You got to channel it.
It's channeled, it has a reason. I'm angry with these people, and I hope that anger can be used to do some good. So maybe that's good for me. I think it's Aristotle who said different types of anger. Some are bad, some are good. I do agree with this. I think there's different ways of dealing with things. Frustration, lack of control, having a terrible bullying boss, being an immigrant. Population with the highest level of heart disease in the world are Australian Aboriginals, followed by almost all other Aboriginal populations around the world. These people had their culture and their lifestyle ripped to shreds. They exist at the bottom of the heap in various countries, and their rates of heart disease are here. The rates of diabetes are here. The rates of heart disease are here. The rates of everything are here. And an Australian Aboriginal on average lives 22 years less than the surrounding European population does. So
wow.
Avoid that. All right. You can see in countries, if you look at the top 20 countries for heart disease, they are almost all ex-Soviet Union countries, plus the Lebanon, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Living in a highly stressed environment is just not good for you. So those are good. Yes. Avoid pollution. Yes. Eat good food. Yes. Get sunshine. Yes. Get some decent, if you've got specific issues, get some decent micronutrients in. Although if you eat good food produced in a local farm or whatever, you probably don't need to do this. And it's not that complicated. These are things that we already know. It's just like living your life as if you were living 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. Not from every perspective, but from a health perspective, it's really important. That would be my kind of takeaway. Unfortunately, I can't make any money out of this because there's nothing patentable here. Dr. Kendrick's unique life extending ideas, which are actually just do stuff that's good for you.
They're all free. Yeah, exactly.
They're all free. Unfortunately,
So
I'm going to patent the sun. I've decided. Yeah.
Malcolm, so where can folks find out more about your work? Maybe pick up your book, all that sort of good stuff. Where can they find you?
If you go, I do a blog called drmalcolmkendrick.org. Yes, .org. Where a lot of this stuff is there. In a way, I'd prefer if people bought the book from this place, from my publishers, the small publishers that I use, because if it goes through a place that sounds like a river that is in South America, they take 70% of all the sales price straight off the front. So it's kind of, I have spent a lot of time writing these books. So you can find out the book called The Clot Thickens, The Enduring Mystery of Heart Disease. It's available in all good online stores and bad ones as well. But through the blog, if you link into there, get it directly as a Kindle, as a ebook version as well. So these are the things that I did. I ended up writing a 900-page series on what causes heart disease, which was kind of not getting it. Was actually, I think it was 69, which I thought I would turn into a book in the end, and this became the book. And then hopefully gives people some better ideas of what causes cardiovascular disease, heart disease, whatever term you want, and how to prevent it. So it's The Clot Thickens is the book, and the website is drmalcolmkendrick.org. If you just type Malcolm Kendrick in, you'll find a few things saying this man is a complete idiot. Don't listen to anything he says. Obviously, I'm on Rational Wiki that says I'm a complete idiot and I don't understand anything about anything. And once you've got through those, sponsored frontline articles, you'll find some people who say this guy is actually quite interesting. And then it's up to people to take from it what they will. I think it's about educating people and getting them to make the decisions that they want to make. Is where it's at, and that's my thing, really.
I will link to all that stuff in the show notes. And I'm glad that you're angry and frustrated about this stuff, because this is, the fruits of your labor. This book is out now and it's super useful, I think, for folks. This information is vital. So yeah, I'm grateful for your work and I appreciate you putting all this stuff together.
Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Kendrick. If you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness, as well as on TikTok at the N1Fitness. I'm also a lot more active on YouTube now, so you can check me out there at Marcus Sadu. Lastly, be sure to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you are using. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that you found this useful, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.